Point we've covered most of the modeling fundamentals and UV wrapping and texturing, so we're really close to being able to actually render really nice images like the one on the screen. The last thing we really need to cover is materials, and so Danny's actually going to go into more detail on Thursday about the really the nitty-gritty of materials. So this is more of just sort of an overview of both how materials work and also how rendering works in Maya. So in order to understand materials, I think the best way to look at it is to begin first by thinking about how you would describe real-world objects. So if you were trying to tell somebody how any of these objects looked and they didn't have an image of it, you wouldn't just describe them using their color because that wouldn't really give them enough information. Obviously, this tree has it reflects the light differently than, say, this vase. And so there's a lot of properties that you can use to describe how an object looks. One of them is how reflective it is, how glossy it is, how metallic it is. There's a lot of different information that you need in order to create an object. And this is also what applies to objects in Maya. So Maya uses, and other software uses materials to define how light interacts with the surface. And it's really important that you spend the time to really fine-tune your materials because it really is going to help achieve really high-fidelity images for your rendering. As you can see here, these are all different materials and they all have different properties. So it's just something to keep in mind. Another good way of describing materials that I found was kind of thinking about it like adding a coat of paint to an object. So when you get paint and you paint, say, a wall or something like that, there's a lot of different properties like how reflective paint is and things like that. And material is basically adding a coat of paint to the object that you've created. So in terms of properties, there's a lot. These are like some of the main sort of topics you'll see when you're adding materials, things like roughness, metalness, specularity. All of these can be fine-tuned to create really interesting materials. I really like this image because you can see just how different you can kind of make a material look. So we're going to kind of dive into how Arnold handles this, and you're going to be able to create some really interesting materials through that. So before we kind of talk about that, we should probably go back to how Maya originally did materials. And this is something that it still uses as default. So these are the three, we're ignoring the constant because that's not really a material. These are the three main ways that Maya has always handled materials. There's three different models, so Phong, Blinn, and Lambert. You might notice that Blinn and Phong are pretty similar, but all of these are kind of approximations of how light interacts with an object. When you create an object in Maya, by default it adds a Lambert, which is this sort of matte look right there. And it does its job, but it's not very good for modern standards. But it's important to know about these because the nice thing about these materials is they work in any kind of rendering software, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. But you should be kind of familiar with these in that if you want to use a default material that's matte, you want to use Lambert, and if you want to use something more shiny, you want to use something like a Phong or a Blinn. So this is just something to keep in the back of your mind. And here's an example of what Arnold is able to render when you apply these materials. So the only ones really to note is that there's two different types of Phong. So Phong is this kind of shiny coat that you can add, and it also has like a sister material called Phong E that kind of makes it more softer. These materials are good, but if you kind of compare them to, say, the materials from like these materials, these materials kind of hit their limit if you want to try to do something like a clear plastic or something really metallic. You really don't want to rely on these. But either way, you should know about them. And if you see at the bottom, it says that these were rendered using Arnold. And this is kind of where I'm going to talk about what a renderer means. So Maya is really good at modeling and animation and things like that. But when you're actually rendering an image, you're not actually using Maya's software. Maya is actually relying on another rendering package that's built into Maya to generate an image. So we've been talking about Arnold all this quarter so far, and that's because it's sort of the default rendering package. But there are many, many other rendering packages that you might encounter. If for some reason, or if you're working in working at an animation job, you might encounter a completely different rendering package, and you shouldn't be afraid because they're all pretty similar. But the general idea here is that you model in Maya, you apply your materials and everything and your lighting, then that file gets sent to the rendering package and it generates the image for you. Maya is not actually rendering the image. And that's kind of just something important to know about. And there's a lot of different renderers out there. When I was looking online last night, they said there was a quote that was renderers are like a religion, which is kind of interesting because I think the point they're trying to get at is that there's like at least 20 or 30 different renderers out there. They're all really similar. I have a picture later on that compares them. You're probably not even be able to tell the difference between them, but people sort of have their own preferences, and some people will live and die by one specific renderer. Ones that you might want to note, so Arnold is the package we're using, and it's owned by Autodesk, which owns Maya. Pixar has their own rendering package called RenderMan that they use to render all of their films, and it's actually, I believe, open to the public now, so other companies are using it, so that's a really popular one. We used Mental Ray for a long time at Cal Poly, and it was pretty robust, but when I looked online recently, the general consensus is that it's outdated, and so generally people say you should avoid it because it's kind of problematic, but in general, there's a ton out there. For now, just focus on Arnold. If you apply to a job after this and they ask you what you use to render your images, remember that it was in Arnold. Just makes you sound more credible. So in terms of like the main differences, like I said, you don't have to worry too much, but the ones that kind of are important to keep in mind is there's really two different ways of classifying a renderer, and it's whether it's biased or unbiased. So really what that means is when it's rendering the image, if a renderer is unbiased, it's going to take as much time as it needs to generate the most photorealistic image as possible. And that might mean it takes 12 hours to render that image, but it'll be really, really photorealistic. A biased renderer is a rendering package that takes shortcuts in order to make the rendering run faster, with the trade-off being that it's a little bit less photorealistic. Chances are people won't really notice these fine details, but in the industry, people have their own preferences. Arnold is an unbiased renderer, which means that it's slower than some other packages, but it's able to render really high fidelity images. Other factors that kind of make differences here are things like how fast it runs. That's a really big deal in the industry because if it runs, even 20% faster than the competitors, that can save you actual money. How user-friendly it is also another factor. Arnold is generally pretty user-friendly, and there's other packages that are a lot more difficult to get your mind around. Price is something that you don't have to worry about as much, but what I really want to get at is that it's mostly personal preference. There's definitely pluses and minuses to each package, but when it comes down to it, there's no like definitive package out there. But getting back into, here's some images that I wanted to show. So these are using 3 different rendering packages. From the back of the room, you probably can't even really see the difference, which is what I kind of want to get at. But if you actually do look at the images, you can see that, for example, like there's definitely like a hard shadow here. This render has more of a softer shadow, and then this one just straight up doesn't even have any shadows here. There's like slight differences, as well as here's the time it took to render each of these images. So this is from an article that was kind of just comparing different rendering packages and sort of exploring what they look like if you've ever wanted to see like why you would want one over the other. I don't know. Can you guys see any differences? There's probably it's there, but it's not something that is a deal breaker, I guess.
Like the lamp, the
Yes.
red body of the lamp is very different.
Yeah. Definitely.
Same for the chair.
And that's another thing is that some renderers are better for certain use cases. So some might render glass way better. I know fur is a topic that's really touchy. So some renderers are really, really good at rendering fur. But if you're a company that only does car ads, you probably don't care about that. So you're going to choose another rendering package. So it's not something to worry about, but yeah. So back to Arnold. It's a pretty powerful rendering software. It's used in the film industry. Movies like Thor and Avengers, Pacific Rim have all used Arnold. So you're using something that professionals actually use, which is pretty cool. Autodesk purchased it a couple years ago. So now if you get Maya, it comes with Arnold. That being said, I think if you're using like the student version, it puts like a watermark on it. So you're not actually getting the full package, but you do get to use it. And there's one last topic I want to get to before we actually dive into Arnold, and it's the topic of physically based materials, or PBR. Has anyone ever heard of physically based rendering. Yeah, so it's kind of become like a buzzword. Really, what this is as I mentioned, there's like these rendering models like Lambert and Phong that we've relied on for a while, and those were approximations. They were never really that realistic, but they got the job done. This is kind of a trend that's been affecting the industry in the past like 5 years, and it's described as more of a concept than a strict set of rules, which means it's not like this is like a specific math equation that's being used now. Really, what the idea is we're actually modeling how light affects materials more accurately than we used to, and we're taking into account light as an actual photon passing through materials and affecting things like refraction and transparency and things like that. And this has been a really big step in getting photorealism. So you don't have to actually understand this diagram, but you can kind of see how nowadays we're able to really explore how light really passes through a medium and bounces around and things like that. And it means that our materials look a lot better.
So is this ray tracing?
This is similar to ray tracing because PBR is used in ray tracing, but in particular it's utilizing effects like refraction and translucency, which is something you don't necessarily explore in every lighting model. One of the cool things about PBR is that we can use what's called photogrammetry, which is using lighting equipment and cameras to actually measure the scientific constants that define materials. And so we've been able to actually draw numbers that reflect how reflective an object is, how metallic and things like that. And it means that we're able to kind of keep a standard when it comes to something like gold. So as an artist, you don't have to constantly, compare your output to pictures of gold and try to fine tweak it. You can actually just apply a gold material and you know that it actually matches the light properties of gold, which is pretty neat. And we're going to be able to explore that in this sort of demo. You'll get to see like Arnold's implementation of that. And yeah, so here's kind of an example of like a scale of reflectivity, and on one end being what they have is rubber is at one end of the spectrum and metal at the other end. So we're getting really close to creating almost, well, I would say photorealistic images, very close to photorealistic images. Are there any questions so far on any of the topics? Cool. And with that in mind, we'll just jump into Maya then. Let me